Hello, theory students. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Introduction to Political Theory course at UMGC. This is the first week of the class, and hopefully you're watching these videos in the order of the philosophers chronologically. This is the first video. This is the video about Plato. It's also a video about Aristotle and John Rawls for this first week. But I want to talk a little about Plato, put Plato in context. There's two readings from Plato. There's one that has to do with what's known as the Allegory of the Cave, and then there's the Crito, which is about Plato's teacher Socrates being in jail. Let's start with this sort of introduction to Plato's thinking, and a nice way to get to Plato's thinking is what's known as the Allegory of the Cave. So the Allegory of the Cave is a story that's found in a larger work that's called The Republic. You're not reading The Republic this week, but you're reading this little short snippet, this story. The story basically goes that, there's people trapped in a cave. They live their whole life in the cave, and all they see are like these shadow puppets that are on the wall. People believe that those shadow puppets are reality. And one person breaks free, goes outside, sees the sun, is blinded, realizes there's more to the world, comes back, tries to tell everyone that there's more to the world, and then the people in the cave kill that person. So there's a lot to break down in this story, but this story really is a nice way to think about Plato's thinking overall. In the Allegory of the Cave, right, Plato wants us to understand that what happens within the cave isn't reality. It's fake. It's illusions, right? The world is made up of illusions, he thinks, right? The cave stands for our normal world, right? We see shadows and images. We don't see truth, right? We see things that we think are true, but they're not actual truth, right? So like the shadow puppets on the wall, the people in the cave think that those are the truth, but there's not. There's more to the world. But the people in the cave are just incapable of understanding and seeing what's true because they're not exposed to it. And then when the person who goes out, breaks free from the cave and sees the true world and comes back and tries to kill them, the people in the cave don't believe that person. And that's why they kill him, because people in the cave are not capable of understanding what's true and what's good and what's right. They want to live in that world of shadows and illusions because that's what they're comfortable with. And so for Plato, most people are the people in the cave. But there are some select people on this world, on this planet, who are capable of seeing beyond the illusions that society presents to us. People who are capable of venturing out of our cave, going out, seeing the world for what it actually is, understanding truth, and coming back and telling us. Right? So Plato believes in absolute truth. He believes in absolute objective right and wrong. There is good and bad, right and wrong, truth and falsehood. And there are certain people in this world who are capable of understanding that. Right? Those people who are able to break free. And in Plato's larger philosophy, right, he refers to those people as philosophers. Okay, so philosophers are people who are capable of understanding truth and knowledge and goodness and right and wrong and justice. And Plato, in the larger work, The Republic, basically says that society should be set up so that those people rule. Right? Currently, in ancient Athenian society, when Plato is living and writing, you have sort of ancient Athenian democracy, right? Direct democracy, direct rule of citizens. Okay? Plato fundamentally objects to this because the majority of people don't understand truth. They don't understand what's good and what's right and wrong. And so what happens is those regular people, the people in the cave, the people who think they know what's right and wrong, are actually making bad decisions. They're not capable of understanding what's actually right and wrong, what's actually good and bad. And so in a democracy, we end up creating a terrible society, because we create rules that are not meant to produce good people. We create rules based upon what makes people happy, what makes people content, what makes people comfortable. And whenever people in a democracy try to disrupt that comfort, democracies ostracize that person, or they kill that person, right? In the case of the allegory of the cave, right? The person comes back in, doesn't know they're doing everything wrong, they kill him. So Plato says democracy is bad. Democracy is bad, and we need to have a system that teaches people truth and goodness and right and wrong and justice, and a system that avoids injustice and falsehood. And the only way to do that is to have a society that's led by people who can understand truth and goodness and right and wrong. So Plato says philosophers should rule. Right? The person who breaks out of the cave and goes out in the sun, right? They need to rule society, because they can create the rules for society that will enable people to live better, more wholesome lives, live virtuous lives, lives geared towards truth and goodness. Where people will not simply do things because it makes them comfortable, makes them happy, but people will be trained to do things because it is the right thing to do, or it is the just thing to do. We need people to learn to act out of a sense of right and wrong, not pleasure and pain. Not everything that's good for you makes you happy. Not everything that's right is pleasurable. But we need a society where people choose to do what's good and what's right because it's good and right, regardless of other consequences. It's always wrong to commit injustice, Plato says. And so we should never create a society where people can actively choose the unjust thing just because it makes us happy, which is what he says happens in a democracy. Okay? So let's, really quickly, in 7.5 minutes, Plato's overall political theory over multiple books. But then we get to the Crito, which is on a similar note, right? It's a dialogue between Plato's teacher, Socrates, and Crito and other friends of Socrates. The background here is that Socrates has been put on trial by the city of Athens for corrupting the youth and a charge that's known as atheism, not atheism as we understand today, right? Not being godless or not believing in God, but believing in the wrong gods, or teaching that the gods of Athens, the gods of ancient Greece, teach things that they don't actually teach, right? So it's not a charge of being an atheist. It's a charge of not quite worshiping the gods in the right way. So he was put on trial, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death, which was the punishment at the time. There's a whole other work about that trial, which is basically another condemnation of democracy, right? Like an extension of the Allegory of the Cave. Socrates has come to tell Athens that they've done bad, awful things, and Athens has decided to kill him because he's the man who broke free, right? He's the man who understands truth and goodness and is trying to tell Athens why they're wrong. And so the Crito takes place after the trial, where Socrates is in jail awaiting his execution, and his friend Crito comes and says, "I've bribed the guards, there's a boat, let's go." And the dialogue is Socrates trying to convince Crito that fleeing is the wrong thing to do. Okay? And Crito makes some important arguments to Socrates, like, you need to continue your work. You're very important to people and society. You tell truth to power. We need to keep you around, right? You need to continue to do your work. You have an obligation to society to preach the truth. And if you die, we can't do that anymore. And Socrates' response to Crito are simple and in some ways compelling, right? I would ask you whether or not you buy Socrates' whether you buy his arguments here. But his arguments there are a couple of them. The first is that, again, it's always wrong to commit injustice, right? And so bribing the guards, fleeing, and avoiding punishment is unjust. And the reason it's unjust, because even though Socrates fundamentally disagrees with the outcome of the trial, he consented to the trial, right? He consented to the Athenian legal system. By choosing to live in ancient Athens, he agreed to abide by the laws of the Athenian society. He agreed to abide by the political system and the justice system. And if you were going to agree to live somewhere and agree to abide by the rules and practices of that society, when that society does something that you fundamentally disagree with, that doesn't mean you just get to ignore it. Right? Yeah, he has an obligation to teach truth, speak truth to power, but he also has an obligation to the society around him. And one of his obligations is to obey. Right? Obey the rules. Right? Argue as much as you want, but in the end, you've got to obey. Right? Socrates was not able to persuade them. He lost. They sentenced him to death. He is obliged to have that punishment carried out against him. And if he were to flee, he would be violating a basic tenet of a social contract, right? An agreement between citizens and the state, where the state, and Socrates says this, the state raised me, right? The state provided me education. It provided me a place to live. It put me in the army and taught me how to fight. It gave me a place to practice my philosophy, right? I took all these benefits from society. I'm obliged as a citizen to obey the legal consequences that society has imposed on me. I can't take the benefits and then reject the consequences if I am found to have broken the laws of society. And so Socrates says it would be wrong to flee. It would be grossly unjust to do so. It would also, he says, be a fundamental break with his overall teachings, which is never to commit injustice. Because Socrates says, if people see that I flee, people will think it's right to disobey the law. And people will think that it's right to commit injustice because the person who said never to commit injustice eventually did it. He would render his entire teachings for the entirety of his life irrelevant. Right? He would have contradicted himself. He would be a hypocrite. And the final reason he gives is if I can disobey the law and I teach people that it's okay to flee or to violate the rules of society, then laws have no meaning. If you can just ignore whatever decision you want, ignore whatever laws you want, ignore whatever consequences you want, do just what you think makes you happy, right? The very thing that he condemns people in democracies for doing things that make you happy and comfortable, not doing the hard things, then law is pointless. Society can't exist. Society can only exist if there are laws and rules and people obey those laws and rules, right? You can argue as much as you want. You can debate as much as you want. You can protest as much as you want. But in the end, when push comes to shove, you've got to accept the consequences of society and the rules of society, right? If you lose, pack up your bags, you try, you reform and you try again. But when society makes its decision, you've got to abide by it. And so Socrates says, I'm not going to flee. It's wrong. It's a crime against my own philosophy. It's a crime against Athens. And it's an injustice. I cannot do it. And you, Crito, ought to be ashamed. Have you learned nothing from my teaching, Crito? Is sort of Socrates' admonishment to it. Okay. So that's a little bit there of Plato and Socrates with the Crito and the allegory of the cave.